Hello, and welcome to another week of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are covering the Unwritten Volumes 7 and 8. I've got to say, you've got some things off the top, but I'm eager to dive into the story as well. And I think this is the most exciting of the podcasts we've done so far, because I find this is getting just so much better and better every week with the cumulative effect of the story, where it's like Paper Girls gets it starts great and it stays great, and it's over in 6 trades. This one is volumes 1 and 2, they're like, oh, that's good, that's fun, they're incredible on reread, but the first time through you're just kind of like, I think I'm starting to get a hang of what's going on here. By 3 and 4 you're like, okay, I get it now. 5 and 6, you get this war that seems like it could be the ultimatum. 7 and 8 you get a soft conclusion to the series, but still so many open threads is ready. So anyway,
there are a lot of open questions there, but I think we talked about this being a bit of a slow burn comic, and 7 and 8 is when there's a lot of action that comes in the head. Obviously the volume 6 was literally called the War of Words. That was actually a big battle, but here we see the aftermath of that. But even now we're seeing a lot of threads laid out in previous arcs, things like,
the children. Yeah.
So right off the bat, we have the children come back. We get Polly's backstory. We see them interact again with Milton, with the Tinker, all these other threads, all these kind of seeming side quests, these kind of ancillary stories that we're getting earlier in the run. This is when everything starts coming together. And it is a soft resolution of the story, all of our storylines and kind of different avenues kind of all come together for the most part at the end of volume 8. But you're right, there are still questions left out there, but there aren't a whole lot of loose threads. There's really only
there's a huge
threads there,
right? I feel like the Roush thing is a huge loose thread. It's she acquires this new power.
Yes, she
states her own purpose.
Yes,
we know that Wilson feels a little uneasy about Roush's purpose.
Yes.
And we don't know if Tommy is ever meant to make it back to the real world. So it's you have those kind of things. That being said, when I knew that this was kind of volume 8 was the end of the main story, in my head all along, I thought Tom really doesn't seem like the type of hero who's bound to survive.
Yeah.
He seems like one who's meant to die.
Yeah.
And when I saw him falling at the end, I thought, oh, I guess that's it. Maybe the story goes on without Tom. Then I see him wake up in the world of Fables, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We're not done with Tom. I can see the covers of the Apocalypse.
He's on them. So spoiler alert, he's still in the story. But yeah, I guess so. Before we dive in real quick, I mentioned the some of these other story ties, these other ancillary stories kind of coming together. That starts off right away in the first issue of volume 7, issue 36, which is the Tinker. Last time we saw Milton, we saw the Tinker. He had drawn a chalk stairway and he was ascending down. He was looking for his great love, and he ends up down the staircase, and he ends up down in the underworld, or the place where lost stories go, and he encounters Polly Bruckner, Mr. Bunn, and that kind of one-off issue. The finishes
wave
on that issue were credited to Rufus Dayglow. So again, a little different storytelling there from Peter, from Gross and Carey, in that we're starting an arc with kind of the weird little one-off, the different story, as opposed to ending as they had been, specifically when it came to Polly's story. So here we get these two kind of side stories coming together, which that seems like fertile ground for bringing in a guest artist again, what they did, Rufus Dayglow coming in with the finishes. And then the other kind of other credited artist is in volume 8. There's a little two-parter with the little kid writing the zombie story. We talked about, you name checked Madame Rouse, that her story in this arc concludes with her kind of getting the power of a little mini Leviathan kind of thing there, and that comes out of that little zombie story, and those 2 issues, 45 and 46, I believe they were. Finishes are credited.
Dean Ormston.
Dean Ormston. Yeah, who great artist. Someone whose work I love a lot, and who had previously worked with them. He was one of the artists that had worked on the 0.5 issues in the last arc. So someone that knew and worked these guys before. But yeah, that's it. Just in terms of kind of additional artists brought on, it's just those 2. It's just Dayglow and Ormston. So
which, by the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but on the trades, starting with these 2, they have the issue numbers on the back. It's why? How did you decide now's the time? Yeah. But anyway, we make it through volume 8, which is 49 issues, really, like 52, 53 with the half issues.
There were 5 maybe 6 half issues. So yeah,
I didn't even realize there were that many. But
yeah, it's 4 or 5. Yeah,
all that say, it's 50 plus issues with really a skeleton crew. I mean, this is that's not a lot of guests. I thought it was quite a few more than that.
Yeah.
I guess I just assumed it would be more than that by the time you get to 50.
Well, I guess even there. So if we throw out the count of the half issues, because those are all, those are all populated by guest artists there.
That's true, but they're all Mike Carey.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. But of all the 49 issues, I mean, there might be 42 of them that are solely credited to Carey and Gross, and that's a hell of a run. That's a hell of a run. That's not easy to do.
To give you some sense of the pace that they were working, I've been emailing Peter Gross, which is the coolest thing I've ever said, about buying some original art from this series, and the process is like not quite as straightforward as it has been with buying from other artists, because other artists, when you're buying artwork, it's finished, whereas some of these still aren't, like the original prints aren't finished. Like he had to ship them out and send them off to the colorist or something like that without all the shading done, or it's not all entirely even inked yet. And so he's like, oh yeah, let me know which one you want. I'll finish it up and then I'll send it out. And I'm like, finish up a book that came out 10 years ago and then he'll send it out to me.
But
that's just the industry, right? I mean,
it is. Yeah. Well, and if you look back at the release schedule, like, they didn't have gaps. They didn't have big, drop offs. They churned these out, and it was really impressive. It's really impressive. They don't, and I'm not throwing shade at creative teams that take breaks. I would prefer that if that's what they feel they need to do to tell their story, in the way they want to. But I think it is notable when you have creator-owned work that has a long run, that doesn't take those breaks, that just churns them out, that you're getting it month after month, maybe one break, a month break here or there to help recharge. But for them to really be on this story and keep it ongoing and to keep it continuous like that, it's noteworthy. And
I find it unreal. I mean, I find it in the same way that I find, like, Aaron Sorkin writing 24 West Wings, 24-hour long, 100-page scripts every week.
Yeah, well, that was
for network television.
That was aided by a lot of cocaine.
Sure. And who's to say,
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe Mike Carey has his own.
What?
Secret.
Again, no judgment. But it is a hard thing. And I think it feels like it's becoming increasingly more rare in comics for to have these super long runs on creator-owned books, and also to go as long as they did uninterrupted. I said, even with some guest artists here and there,
right?
To still have books come out, because again, we mentioned last when they did the half issues, those weren't replacing the monthly issues; those were coming out in addition too. So they're coming every 2 weeks, with those half issues. So it is actually twice the work for that. That those half issues really aren't easing the work. They're not making anything easier. It's actually just more work to get those books out. So for them to keep going, for them to go as long as they did, and to get all the way through issue 49 at the end of volume 8 is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, just Herculean achievement. And since you started by talking about the artists, I opened the first issue, and one of my favorite things here is when Tinker pulls Polly Bruckner by his ears.
Yeah.
And now some of this is great sketching and you know, Peter Gross's just signature great art. But Chris Chuckery, the shading around Polly's eyes, making him look so haggard, because we know how much he's been through at this point in time. We already know he's cantankerous and has a short fuse, but he is just level 10 pissed. The second you see his like angry little face with his beady eyes. And it's so good. And it continues through, you know, through that whole issue that Polly's just like beyond wit's end.
You can sense his burnout. You can sense his fatigue. You can sense everything about it, all the mood. Just in how the face is colored around the eyes. You can sense all that through the page.
Especially when you see the other cartoon rabbits and they're all looking much healthier than Polly.
Yes, yeah. Healthy is a good word. That's a good word. Like you can tell how I'm not going to say ill, but how unhealthy Polly is at this point. How haggard he is. It all comes through. You're right. On top of the fact that we know he's already someone with a short fuse, someone who's prone to flying off the handle. You can just see it and it comes across as a bunny.
I also love when he's having that discussion about calling waxed fruit. You see that the Tinker is holding Polly's hand as he's yelling up the castle wall at the other rabbits, and I'm like, how endearing is the Tinker that Polly is allowing this? He's just like the most sweet, gentle, like true golden age hero who says things like "Jumpin' Jehoshaphat," and it has seemingly softened the cold heart of Polly Bruckner, only to find out that Polly is still willing to club him over the head and take his bag of tricks when he needs it. So anyway, I thought that was a just perfect way to start this, introducing this concept of the wave, which will come back, and is really the real world effect of the wound before you find out what the wound is.
You're left at the end of volume 6 with Leviathan, having been injured. We see that, we see Pullman die, we see Lizzie die, we see all this stuff here, and then we jump into this story now, and we see, okay, you kind of internalize this is what the consequences, right? This is what's happening. This has to be what's happening because of the end of volume 6. But it is very cool, and also I really love what they do here, because they shove so many other literary references in. You have the segment with the Tinker pulling out all the various swords, like all the various literary swords from story and folklore, and then you have the great splash page with
the ships and the elephant,
the ships, the buildings, the
barn, castle,
a tower with a flaming eye that looks suspiciously like Barad-dûr from Lord of the Rings. But you have a farmhouse. You have all these things there. All of these, again, literary references that they get to really throw into the story, and they get to put it all into that issue, which I think is really fun. Those are fun Easter eggs for people who know, like if you recognize the sword names and things like that.
Well, and there's a lot more of that coming with the Bennett sisters and the one that I was not familiar with, which was Carl Friedrich Hieronymus von Munchausen, who I had to look up, which, that's just another literary character it's a German noble from a Russian novel. So, but he ends up becoming an important character. And this is where the series reminded me. Are you familiar with the work of Jasper Fforde?
I am not, no.
He's a fictional writer. And one of the things he's most popular for is a series called Nursery Crimes, and basically the premise is like they're for adults, they're detective books, but they're set in a world where every fictional story exists. So the first one is called The Big Over Easy, and it's about Humpty Dumpty and his legal case for suing for having fallen off the wall.
Okay.
And so he's just interacting with all of the other nursery tale characters who have ever existed. Again, sounds like it's for children, but it's for adults. And it's like this very serious detective looking into these nursery crime cases. But anyway, as he's going through, you just get little exciting Easter eggs like, oh, that's that's from this other fairy tale, and that's from this tale. That's very similar vibe.
That's interesting because that's a very similar vibe, what you're describing, to what Fables kind of is in terms of how storybook characters interact or do or don't interact with the quote unquote real world. So that's interesting.
First one of those is from 2005.
Okay. All right.
And he's written a few other series, and then there's a one. His most recent book, I think, was called The Constant Rabbit, and I think that was not part of that series, but was supposed to be outstanding. That was published in 2020. And I was thinking of Jasper Fforde, and then I thought, oh, yeah, Constant Rabbit, that's on my audiobook queue. And then I realized, now I'm reading about a different rabbit.
Yes.
Polly Bruckner.
But yeah, there are, I think you're right. There are a ton of Easter eggs. It is fun to see. And I guess the end of that is, I guess, we see what the actual wave is. The actual wave is the blankness of the nothingness. The
perfect whiteness of an unwritten page.
Yeah.
I feel like they're getting a lot more clever with their use of the word unwritten.
Yeah, I have a note that too. They're getting much more mileage out of the phrase the unwritten. And obviously we'll get to that once we jump back into Tom and Richie's story there. But the end result is we see Polly turn back into a human. He is no longer the rabbit, and he goes off into kind of whatever's the empty voidness. And obviously we'll come back to him later in volume 8. But yeah, it's an interesting way to start off this next trade after the ending of volume 6, because I guess volume 6 actually doesn't end with the battle there, because it actually ends with Daniel's story.
Yes.
Yeah, there's the story of Daniel.
Which was a great tag at the end of that.
Yeah, because you see him in the background of all those of all the moments from the comic. So we're basically now 2 issues removed from the quote unquote final battle there between Tom and Pullman, where Leviathan was injured, Pullman dies, Lizzie dies. So we're like now 2 issues away from that before we jump back into their story. And we jump back into their story, we're it's clear we've jumped into the future.
Yes, I think we're a year later. And
yeah.
Quite brilliantly, they basically make you wait till the end of Trade 7 to see Tom again. I mean, this is all about the impact of Tom's actions, but Tom himself does not show up. He's kind of a mysterious figure. You hear about Richie, you get a flashback of what happened immediately after that.
Yes.
But Tom doesn't show up until he's on stage at the event.
Yeah.
Which is at the very end of this trade.
Mm-hmm.
So just totally brilliant. By the way, just
was
pause.
it a year later? Sorry. Was it a year? I don't remember that. I know it's sometime in the future after those events there. I don't.
I think it was 6 months or a year. I think there was some like one passing memory. I think it doesn't really matter other than the fact that this isn't the next day.
Yeah, we have jumped in the future. Yeah, we're now back into the world where Tommy is this worldwide speaking celebrity. Richie is a best-selling author. He has written a book called The Unwritten. Presumably, it is the story of the first 6 trades of the Unwritten. Like he is a journalist, so he's reporting that. I do have questions about that.
I've got big questions about that. Yeah, and I mean, I'm wondering how it's selling so well.
Yeah.
So wait, before I get to that,
sure.
We mentioned at the end of the whiteness of the unwritten page, and the final text boxes in the first issue are and considering that the Tinker was already heading for the land of the dead. So I think I was totally with this. I didn't get hung up on this until I was writing my notes. I'm having trouble keeping track of what all of the world distinctions are.
Yeah.
There's the real world, there's the fantasy world, there's the land of the dead, but then there's also like a hell that's different than the land of the dead. Right.
Yeah.
So I would have thought this whole realm where they're interacting was the land of the dead, but it's not.
Yes.
Because then Tom is in volume 8, and he has to find a way to descend to the land of the dead from there. So it's like, okay, so it's not like I don't think there's even a finite number of these type of dimensions. I think that's the point that's made the first time we meet Polly Bruckner, which is like nothing's ever deleted.
Yeah.
There's always a different way to relegate things, but bad things don't just go away. They just get obscured. And I think that's going all the way back to Trade 2.
I think, yeah, and I think the only thing that the only kind of guidepost that I go back to, because it is hard to wrap your head around that, at the beginning of volume 8, when we get Didge's story, Detective Peterson, after she is touched by Pullman's hand and descends into whatever world they're in, obviously first person she meets is Lizzie there. And she asks, it said that the ferryman, you're telling me we're dead. And Lizzie responds, no, we're in an old story about the dead, not the same thing. And then there's a pause. She says, I hope. So and so the question,
I love how everyone is like living in the rules of the world while guessing at the rules of the world.
Exactly.
Which is the same as the reader.
It is, yeah. But I think my takeaway from that, and my takeaway from that, so that's where Tom descends into, and then of course when they're all there and they eventually get to the Polly's castle, they go into the other realm, which is the realm ruled by the demon version of Pullman. To jump ahead through 8 there. But the way I interpreted that is that all these levels exist, meaning that there are basically, I guess, there are multiple places of kind of existence there, and the place where we start out, in issue 36 there with Paul and the Tinker, and the place that Tom first falls into, I think that is meant to be just the collective world for all stories, and everyone is now lumped together because Leviathan is dying. So that is the level of, I guess if you think about it from like I don't know, like Inception or something like that, about going down a level, the level right below the real world that's the story level, storybook level, and all those are different. They're all on the same level, but they're all different worlds because they're all different stories.
Because the Leviathan can keep them clear and distinct in his mind.
Yes, yeah. But
since he's wounded, everything's bleeding together. He's losing focus.
Exactly. Yeah. So when Polly is in the Willowbank Tale story and Tom falls into Moby Dick, you can think of them technically on the same level, but in different individual
hard
stories.
Partitions.
Yeah. And so now those walls are all down. So that one level down is just the world of everything all mixed together. That's when you see, like, again, the Bennett's and all that, and all these characters mixed in, when Tom falls down in there and he sees the Pequod and all that. So he's seeing the remnants of all these stories. And then there's a level below that, which is the unwritten level, I guess, because that's where Lizzie ends up. That's where Didge ends up. That's where, the two kids, the warden's kids, from the French prison, they end up there. So that's where you go when you die. But again, is that the actual underworld? Is it the underworld for stories? Is it a story about the underworld? That seems to be unclear, but that does appear to be one level lower than where Tommy first meets up. He has to go to that level first and then go a level deeper. I think, in my mind, that's how it goes. And then from when they're there and they go into the interaction with Pullman as the devil, I think that's a lateral move, as like another version of the underworld.
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
I think.
Well, I mean, right. That's all we have to go on. Unless we get Mike or Peter on the podcast, and even then, they might say, "I think it works like this." In fact, it wouldn't stun me if they said like the rules exist, but I'm telling a story within those rules, and I, like the characters, like the reader,
are guessing at it
with what we have, which I would actually kind of admire in a certain way. But I think this idea of levels, let me just say, the greatest single page of art is when Wilson Taylor has Polly Bruckner by the neck, and then there's this sharp divide, and you see him transform down into Rabbit Polly Bruckner.
I was gonna come back to that. Those pages,
we'll get
because
to it. I know it goes from Sin City to like a children's story. In the same page. It's so good.
With the outline of there's like the chalk outline of a human body, which is Polly's body, right on the divide. Those pages are really, 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 really cool there. God, where were we? You know what? I guess
I haven't made it past the first issue yet.
I know we haven't really, but I guess the other thing that's important to mention here, we talked about after we come out of, it was resetting where the characters are. Again, Tom's on tour. Richie is this best-selling author. We know Lizzie is dead. We all think she's dead at this point. And the important thing is the cult of Tommy. The people who believe Tommy's the Messiah. The character we saw, what is it? Philby, right? What was his first name? Lucas Philby, a guy that we saw, the guy who in the very first arc, the guy who's, Tom is Tommy, that whole thing. That cult around Tom Taylor has now become this huge movement. And so the bigger that Tom gets going on these speaking tours and things like that cult has grown to kind of an immense size. And that's where we get Detective Patterson, Didge. She comes in because there are these string of missing person cases. And so she's investigating that. And so that's kind of where all of our characters are. That's how everyone comes together. And there's Daniel too. Daniel, who felt compelled to go to Brisbane because he felt, he saw a message in the ruins of the Cabal and the Grid. So that's how everyone kind of gets to Australia. That's where Tom is doing his story. And Richie being a vampire, he can fly anywhere he wants very quickly. So that's kind of where we are resetting the narrative aspect of it. But you wanted to, before we jump into that, you want to get back into Polly's a little bit right there, because I do want to talk about those pages.
I think that's not until later in the volume. So I guess it's a matter of whether we do this chronologically in storytelling or by characters. There's not much. I don't think there's anything else for the Tinker, right? He's done.
Yes. Yeah.
At least for now. If I've learned anything from this book, it's so. Here's just what's so amazing to me: the number of things that early on I was whining about. I think I did it on the podcast. I was like, as soon as I get attached to a character or a story, they switch to something else that I don't care about. And as soon as I start to get any traction with that at all, they move on. And I loved that standalone issue of the kids and their background. Mm-hmm. And then they died the next issue. And I was like, that's so wasteful. And then they come back and I look like a fool. That's documented on a podcast now. How foolish my lack of trust in Mike Carey is, that he would waste resources like that. And the fact that you get like these little glimpses, I think even in volume 1, of Tom as a child holding a book, walking in on his dad, strangling a guy. And Wilson's like, go to bed, and it was like, well, that seems like kind of weird and traumatic, and seems like it would have a formative effect on something, but it's never really brought up again, other than to say he has a weird childhood. But then it's like, nope, that actually comes up. In fact, it came up at the end of volume 2 because Polly's there because of Tom, not because of Wilson. Yeah.
Well, what I love about that specifically is every time it's brought up, it's recontextualized. First, it's like you see it as, oh, Wilson is this brutal man, and he did this to Polly. So that's Polly's his vengeance. But then you see that Tom was there, and he witnessed this, and so now it becomes this traumatic memory for Tom, which then becomes indicative of why can't Tom remember his childhood? So now it's less about the specific act of Wilson beating this guy up and more about Tom's inability to, he can't remember. He witnessed this brutal act by his father and he has no memory of it. Why can't he remember that or anything else from his childhood? And then we get further and we see that, this is, and maybe I'm getting the order wrong here, but you see that, the people that were coming after him, this is on the order of Pullman. These people are from the Cabal and they were part of Wilson's time with them and all this stuff there. And so every time we go back to it, we learn something different up until the final reveal that, yes, this was Wilson. Yes, it was basically a hit on him. Yes, Tom was there, but it wasn't Wilson. You're right. It was Tom who did this. And there's that little bit there where Wilson is proud of Tom.
Yes.
Where he's like, good job. Cause I guess it's the first time he's, whether intentionally or not, able to access that power, And so it shows a demented side of Wilson there. And that in this moment where you have to assume left unchecked would have beat this man to death with his bare hands.
I mean, yeah. So I think the funny thing is that we look at Wilson both in that situation and with Lizzie, and we're like, oh man, what a monstrous guy, what a horrible father. But if you put him in a wheelchair and name him Charles Xavier, and he's teaching young children to manipulate really dangerous power, and even putting one in isolation for her own protection, it's like, oh no, he's the good guy. But since we're coming at this from the child who doesn't understand what's going on, Wilson looks like a total monster, and Wilson apologizes. I mean, yeah. I don't think he regrets doing it. I think he just regrets the impact that it's had.
He is 100%.
He got the outcome he wanted. Yeah,
exactly. He is 100% on team for the greater good.
Yes.
And he is also someone who maybe not towards the actual end of his life there, and when we see him later in 8 there, but up until that point, I'm sure, completely believes that it was his sacrifice. Look what I had to do. This is what I had to give up.
Right.
And not thinking about the fact that he royally screwed up his son. And not thinking about the trauma there, he's looking at no, you don't know what I had to do, how difficult this was for me. I've sacrificed all this stuff. I'm sure up until the point where he gets killed by Pullman in what is that, volume 3 or 4 there. I firmly believe that is his mindset. That if you were to ask him, he's like, yes, I was terrible. Yes, I did these things. No, I don't regret them because we've won. But he would counter back and be like, listen, I had to do all these terrible things. Look at how hard this was for me to do. He would delude himself to think that.
Well, but I also think there's truth in that because I do think he genuinely loves Tom.
Yeah.
But he had to prioritize his mission over just making Tom happy.
And he would say that, look how difficult that was for me to do. And Tom would say, but look what that actually did to me,
Right. Which is that we're going back to the original, the spark of the original premise, which is the Christopher Robin stuff.
Yeah. There is this hurt me because I had to hurt you. And the other person being like, yeah, but I'm the one who actually got hurt.
Right.
So you can't compare your perception of me being hurt versus me actually, dealing with the pain of that. And I think that's that. So I think Wilson.
I mean, I think it's similar to now I have a 5-month-old baby and, we take her to the doctor to get her vaccinations. Yeah. And as soon as the needle goes in and comes out, it's going to be blood curdling screams. And you're like, I don't want this discomfort for you, but I, as a parent, am choosing this for you for the greater good, basically. And I think it's just a few steps from there, which most every responsible parent does that. But it's just a few small steps from there in Wilson's mind to doing what Wilson did.
Oh, that's one step for him. Definitely.
It might not even be a step. It might just be the same thing.
It might be. Yeah. It just the idea of what I have to do, my mission, what he believes his goal is the most important thing. And, he can say, oh yeah, I understand I take responsibility for these things. I know they hurt you, but you don't know how much it hurt me to do it, how much I had to sacrifice, what I had to lose in order to do the thing that no one else was brave enough to do, or strong enough to do. You always hear that kind of rhetoric from people like that, of like, I was the only one. That's the Thanos rhetoric, right?
I was like, you're slipping into Thanos right now.
But that's the same kind of mindset. Like, look what in Thanos's mind, he was like, listen, I'm the only one strong enough to do this. I had to give up my entire planet, and all the dead people on Titan are like, we gave up our life. So yes. why are you so much better? So yeah, there is that delusion there. But I do think when we see him again, as really kind of the shell of a man down in Paulie's dungeon there in 8, I think there's starting to see a little bit of maybe self-realization there, because I do wonder what Wilson thought the end result was going to be. Like, did he always do this with the idea of thinking that Tom was like, what was winning for him? What was winning for Wilson? Was it just taking down the Cabal? Was it what Pullman wants, which is to destroy Leviathan and thus free the world of control from all stories? Did Wilson think Tom was going to live through this? Did he think he had to die? All these things there. I wonder what he thinks winning was supposed to look like. Or if he ever got that far in his planning, because was winning for him just defeating the Cabal, right? And then that's it. Well, Tom did that, but the world ain't fixed. The world is still in a lot of trouble there. The world's still falling. And
knowing, Wilson, he defected from the Cabal, as like kind of a hitman. Like he wasn't on the inner circle.
No,
does he even know about the Leviathan?
Well,
most of the Cabal didn't.
Well, I think he. Well, that's a good point. The specific.
I think I think he's groping in the dark. I mean, I think Tom now knows more than Wilson did.
He might.
And you see Tom, Tom does not have the disdain for his father in Volume 8 that he did in Volume 3.
No. I think part of that.
And that's not because Wilson changed. That's all Tom's journey.
Yes, I think part of it is watching him die, and then him coming to understand what's at stake, and everything he's experienced. So yeah, definitely, he's much softer to him. Again, not like full forgiveness or all that, but there's a level of understanding that Tom has now. And you're right. It's less because of Wilson and all because of Tom.
Which I think is, that's how a lot of people with rough childhoods have to grow, is you cannot be waiting for the person who wronged you and is objectively messed up and they're the problem to recognize that and come fix it. You have to figure out how to deal with it on your end. Because you can't change or control other people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm very happy to see Tom get there. Tom is now a character worth rooting for.
Yes,
and
I told you he gets there eventually.
And I don't even know when that happened. I feel it in these ones, but I'm not sure when that switch flipped for me.
Now
maybe Volume 4.
I think for me, I think it is when he kind of embraced the duality of his character. The idea of like, wait a minute, things. I think for him, when he right after he picks up Glitter Spar and does magic for the first time, that isn't the moment there. It's the following moments when he realizes that he can be an active participant in this. That this isn't that the character of Tommy Taylor isn't just something that's happening to him. It's something that he can tap into and activate and choose to engage with, and that's on multiple levels. That's engaging with the fandom and the hype on the story, and also, as Wilson would want to, like, literally engage with the story to tap into this power and this reservoir of ability. I think when he makes that choice to become an active participant is when, for me, the character kind of changes. But I think the big thing really is he changes so much in this like 1 year gap from the end of volume 6 to when he's doing these speaking engagements slash reading slash jazz trumpet concerts,
right.
Because when he does show up in volume 7, you're right, he shows up in what, issue 39 or 40, I guess, out of 41.
I'm reading a trade, so I'm like, I don't know.
So he shows up like 2/3 of the way through when he comes up on stage, and then the Tommy that gets up on stage and is reciting kind of this mantra, he's explaining his ethos of what he's trying to do and what his goal is. That's a version of Tommy we hadn't seen anywhere else. This is a fully enlightened Tom Taylor. And then obviously once Philby and his team come up and try to attack him, and watching him open up Judge Suisse and like unleash that like a weapon and control it, so all that talk from volume 3 about the canker and how poison stories can become poison and how that can become real and manifest out and destroy the world and become harmful, to basically watch him just have mastery over that. He opens the book, I guess, start reading the story, engulfs everyone he needs, all these cult members except for Philby, and just shut the book and be done with it. And last time we saw the Judge Suisse world, it was running rampant and could take over everything until Tommy tapped into a power he didn't even know he had unconsciously. So now to see him do it just like it's nothing, like this is all part of him now.
Right.
This is a version of the character we haven't seen yet, and I think
I think that's what we had to wait for, right? Because this is Neo showing up in Matrix Reloaded, where it's like at the end of the first Matrix movie, he shakily does a couple things. By the beginning of the next one, he's like a maxed out video game character when you enter cheat codes.
I was going to say, I'm really going to say it's the final scene. So we see him in the hallway fight when he stops the bullets and does all that stuff. And then, when
he hangs up the phone and starts flying. Yeah.
And he flies
away.
And you can see the clothes are a little different. The sunglasses are a little different. And he can now fly.
But he just carries himself differently because he knows he's in complete control.
I think
he's not looking over his shoulder. He's not worried if an agent shows up.
The Matrix is a great way because Tom now, he sees the code, if you use that metaphor. He understands what the stories are and also his role in them, what he can do with them. So let's push this metaphor a little further,
because what's happening is basically the code of the Matrix in the Unwritten is our collective conscious of shared fiction, like shared story, shared narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's starting to erode. Now imagine if someone were trapped in the Matrix, but all of the fictions and trappings of the Matrix started kind of dissolving, and things lost their color, and like all the food lost its flavor. Like living in the Matrix would really suck then. Because now you're just living in a machine that doesn't have anything ornate or special about it. And that's what Roush is telling them is happening. Like Roush is saying, people will lose all sense of self and meaning and purpose, and it's already happening. And that was what I really wanted to dig into. There were a couple quotes that I had set aside. One of them was Roush, which I think maybe you had.
Yes.
But since we're talking about Tommy there wielding full power, he says this: I learned the hard way that the stories about us are stronger than we are and more durable. When you think about yourself, about your real true self, it's not the face you see in the mirror that comes into your mind. It's the story of you, how you got here, where you're going, all the moments that make you who you are. But that's not all. Religion, philosophy, politics, and science, they're all stories with the whole universe as the hero. We believe and we listen, and if we like what we're hearing, we accept it. And you see the people's faces as they're hearing this. And I think this is really interesting. So, and Roush gets into this as well, that, human life would be unlivable. Do you have the exact quote? Untenable, maybe.
Yeah. Roush, and I think what's important here, and this will tie both these together, in that in this scene, Roush is talking to Richie. She's basically summoned Richie to somewhere in the Alps to talk to him, and the line she gives is, but in the end, without story, without the ability to step sideways from fact into hypotheses, human life is untenable. And so the idea that if we don't have fiction, if we don't have a way to almost like lose ourselves in story and get away from just truth and fact and the world, that actually causes us to lose our grip on reality. If all we have is the facts, if all we have is what is and not what could be, said untenable is the word she used. And again, I think it's important she's talking to Richie there, because that ties, I think, to what the quote you read from Tom, because Richie has experienced this now too. We've seen, we see from that flashback that Richie has come to the realization that, yes, he's a vampire, but now he's like a grotesque monster,
right.
That physically he is this way. And so him and Tom have this parting of the ways, because Richie on some level is pissed at him, because he realized, because they go back to the villa, and who's in the villa but all these ghosts? Who are these ghosts? These ghosts are the people who have died around Tom, and they come to the realization that they're just side characters in Tom's story,
right?
And Richie has that realization, and he doesn't like it, so he goes off, he leaves, and he writes his book. He writes The Unwritten, and one would assume, as a journalist, that even though Richie has some questionable ethics, that's probably mostly a true story. He's recounting everything. He's doing the thing that Pullman didn't want anyone to do, which was write about that cabal. But he also wrote about themselves. He wrote about Tommy, he wrote about Lizzie. He wrote about himself, to the point where he has this international bestseller with millions and millions of copies written, where everyone reads a story that Richie Savoy is a vampire, Right. And this is meant to be a nonfiction book, right? He's recounting the story. Now, we, the reader, know that because of the story machinations, that vampires do exist, and Richie actually was a vampire. But because he put it into this story, even though it's not a fictional story, it's still a story about his life. And that's what Tom talks about the story of his life, whether it's the fictional version of Tommy Taylor that his dad wrote, or all the new stories about Tom Taylor, him. A story is a story. And by putting that forward, Richie talks about, listen, thanks to me putting in this book, like I now am a vampire by acclamation, because he was able to tap into the same sort of thing that Tommy was able to, in terms of how that collective, I guess the fictional unconscious is what was referred to earlier. But here again, we're talking about the proliferation of a nonfiction story.
Right.
This journalistic story that's still able to have the same effect on Richie and on the world, because a story is a story is a story. And again, that's what Tom talks about when he's talking about religion, philosophy, science, politics, all these things here, all the narratives were being shown.
Right.
Yeah. And again, when we go back to the news story, when they go to the panels for the newscast, when we see all the pages of the web browsers, the various sites, the reply message boards and things like that, all of these are stories. They're all versions of stories, and all of them feed into whatever this power is in this story. So it doesn't have to be a fictional story. It doesn't have to be made up.
But you made an interesting statement, though, because you said he wrote the truth about what happened to Tom Taylor.
Yeah, you would.
The trick is, whatever he wrote, if enough people believed it, becomes the truth about Tom Taylor.
And so one of my questions was, one of the great bits that I loved as we went through that, especially when him and Lizzie were going down to go after and help Tom, Richie kept talking about his vampire powers, not even knowing what they were. So turns out, yes, he can turn into a whole bunch of bats and fly somewhere and come back together. Check. Turns out he doesn't have super strength. So they need to get the rocket launcher to blow the door open. So
okay, but let's talk about this, because
but what if in the story
tells the woman he's with that she's like, okay, what's the real deal with this vampire stuff?
Yeah.
And he's like, this is what happened.
Yeah.
She gets mad for him lying about it.
Yeah.
Well, but does she think that because the Leviathan is wounded and she's incapable of believing in that type of fiction?
Oh, that's good.
That's how I read it.
Oh, that's good. I hadn't thought about that.
I read that he's going nuts because he's telling the truth and people are incapable of believing a narrative.
That's good. That tracks. That tracks. Actually, I simply read that as the story was so fantastical that they've accepted.
Yeah, and I think under normal circumstances, that's what you would say.
That's a good point.
Given what's happening in the world, I think that's a clever way to show it. To show like
that's fun. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I like that.
You know, and she's accepting that he's a vampire, but not accepting the means by which he became one. I think she doesn't think he's a real vampire. I think she thinks it's a fetish that he has.
I think so too. Yeah,
and he's a he's a pseudo celebrity.
Yeah.
So it's like, we endorse his fetish, but I would really like to know where this weirdness comes from.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that though. But but kind of even though but still it goes back to the idea that he managed to write his own story and said not just be. He doesn't have his powers because he's a character in Tom's story. He now has his life because he was able to tap into that same reservoir of power and magic, that it is, he was able to take control of his story and do it in a way that was kind of, I guess, beneficial for him or helpful for him. And not just as a side character in Tom's story, which I think is an interesting pivot for not a pivot, but an interesting aspect of the story and of the character to show that it's more than just Tom here, that we build stories up here that they can have effects outside of just what's happening to Tom.
Yeah. Which is, it's the whole premise coming around on itself.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And it's just great. So, I mean, and I think that basically, aside from the zombie stuff, that covers Richie's arc here. I mean, that catches us up on Richie. You want to finish Richie and do the zombie stuff, or should we do this whole detective thing in Brisbane that leads to, Didge and Danny? There's a Daniel.
I guess we can do the zombie part and then go back to Didge, because the zombie thing is only.
Then we're done with Richie, right?
Yeah.
We're done with Richie. We're done with Rausch.
Yeah.
Once we do that.
Yeah.
So let me say, and this is all in volume 8, right? And the zombie stuff.
Yes.
It's it's classic Mike Carey. You get to the climax of the underworld stuff, and it's like, here's a 2-issue break to do this zombie thing. And I was thinking,
and also it also works because it's another one of those things where Tom is no longer in our main story. Tom is somewhere else. It's just like when he went into Moby Dick the first time, and that left Lizzie and Richie out there on their own. Well, now it's Richie still on the outside, but it's what is going on for the time that, when they leave Daniel out in the Australian brush, and he's like, I'm going to wait here for him. And Richie's like, listen, last time he was gone for 3 months. Maybe you don't want to do that. So right. Richie just knows, okay, listen, I'm going to go. And so him and Didge go and do this other thing. And they have this side quest with, this kid who is writing zombie stories that are coming to life. Because as we find out, he has this little bit of the Leviathan there, this little small bit of power. So.
Which is, it's a similar discovery to, I was in volume 5 when Wilson first meets, the Tinker creator.
Yes.
She read
Miriam.
Miriam. Yes.
Yeah. Miriam.
That Miriam, through her own conviction and power of belief, perhaps, has conjured an actual ability.
Yes.
And this boy, whether he meant to or not, has done the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom was genetically engineered to do that as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting. To me, it's a little bit, it's distinct from like a midichlorian thing, because I think in the Star Wars universe, this kid would be the only way you get this power. Whereas Wilson proved you can create it synthetically with Tom.
He manifested it. Yeah. By kind of running the story and the actual child, like running them in parallel, doing it at the same time, he was able to manifest this.
And I love that idea that it can it's unlike, if you're like in the Harry Potter universe and you're born a Muggle and you're not like a Muggle born person with magic, there's no way for you to get it. Mm-hmm. You can't tap into that power just by discovering it, studying it, choosing to do it. And I love that in this universe, the ones who wield power, some of them are occasionally, born with it or more inclined to it, but anyone can get it. Like, regardless of Tom Taylor's personality, Wilson would have put him through whatever he needed to put him through to make sure he got this power.
It seems to come from, I think there's a bit of the idea of that Leviathan has some sort of choice there because he feeds on stories, so it's almost like if you're out there and you're creative and you're writing and you're really kind of exploring that space, it's almost like you're being gifted that, right? It's like Miriam was out here doing this work, telling these stories, and it was like she was almost gifted this ability because of her understanding of story and because she could see kind of the wide angle lens of everything. It's not just she understood she was not just writing these stories for the hell of it. She was really putting herself into it. So when she met up with Wilson and he gave her a little more insight because of his work with the Cabal and all that, she was able to expand that even further. And then it really kind of fills her up. Then you have this little boy who is almost like he inherits this and doesn't even know what the power is. He can't control it. He doesn't know what's going on with it. But he can't help it. Because I think as he talks about it, as he writes these stories, he can't help but see the people he knows. He sees their faces. And by doing that, that connects them to the story, So he's writing these zombie stories, but he can't write them as just random people. He has to put the people he sees around them in them because he has no control over what he's doing, So in his case, it's not really a gift, but it's a power that's been kind of bestowed on him.
Yeah. And the Leviathan's interesting to me. It seems like he has his own taste and preference, but he also is kind of subject to the zeitgeist. It's a symbiotic relationship with humanity. He likes what a lot of people like, and a lot of people like what he likes.
He's a populist, sure.
I mean, but that's like, he's really into Tommy Taylor because Tommy Taylor's extraordinarily popular. Yeah. And it's kind of a meta commentary that at the time these issues were written, zombie stuff was blowing up. It was like you had you had The Walking Dead in TV and comics at this point. Yeah. You were starting to get what was the Brad Pitt movie that was based on the book, World War Z.
World War Z.
You had Zombie Land. It was like zombies were big. And it was like starting to cross genres. It was like, it started as horror, but then there's comedy, and there's Shaun of the Dead, so it's transgressing boundaries. And the Leviathan's like, oh yeah, I like zombie stuff. And so this kid starts making zombie stuff, and the Leviathan's like, yeah, I'm in a zombie mood right now. Yeah. Because the world was in a zombie mood. So I think it's just like a little. So at first it really irritated me. I was like, oh my gosh, zombie stuff is so played out. Then I remembered when this was written, I was like, okay, it was the peak of the zombie stuff. And then I was annoyed that they jumped on that bandwagon. But then I realized there's no way you can't. Like, you have to deal with whatever is in the zeitgeist. That's part of the mechanics of the story.
Sure.
And I think, by the way, just to be meta for a moment, as I was shelving these on my Goodreads account, one of the genre tags that a lot of people use is urban fantasy, which was a genre tag I was not familiar with. So I read up on that. Fantasy. And urban fantasy is a term that just means it's a fantasy story that uses pre-existing locations, places, like it's nested into our world. So like instead of him creating an alternate world where like he renames New York City Metropolis or something like that, he's like, no, we're just going to take all the ingredients that are already in play and tell our own fantasy story. And I was like, oh, that's the kind of fantasy I like. I just didn't know there was a term for it. Because, I like that Harry Potter is nestled within our existing world. And like London's a real place, but there's also all this magic. And that in the Unwritten, like he didn't need to invent other countries and things like it's like there's so much stuff going on. And not only that, it's kind of like the way I've always heard people describe making a fruitcake. It's like whatever's left on the counter, you just shove it all in. It's like he'll just take every ingredient laying around and roll it into one thing, and I love it. Because like I think like the high fantasy people would be like, no, you have to invent a language and a backstory for all the characters.
Yes.
And you have to like write your own maps, and you have to make your own cities. And an urban fantasy storyteller is like, no, I don't need to do that, because it's going to be about the story and it's going to be about the characters, and I can use pre-existing settings for that. So anyway, that was just a genre tag that I've never heard before, but I looked it up, and it's a real term that people use.
Sure, no, that makes sense, because I enjoy those stories as well. I like something that's grounded, that has basis in our quote unquote real world.
Yes.
So I know what those rules are, because that's supposed to be Chicago. That's supposed to be LA. That's supposed to be Brisbane. It's supposed to be London. It's supposed to be these places. But then
even if you understand, it's kind of like italicized. It's like, it's London.
Yeah. But like versus this is Gotham City. This is Metropolis.
Right. And
that sort of thing.
It always does bother me on some level.
This is Westeros, and this is Essos, aka this is where the white people are, and then this is where the brown people are.
Right.
Like it's
even tracking this from like Marvel to DC. And I know you're not a video gamer, so I'll keep it brief. But like when you play the Arkham series games, each time you play one of those games, and they're all in the same series, the map of Gotham is different. Because there's no canonical, like, that there are parts of town, and there are like good parts, and like, the Falcons and Maroons are over here, but they rearrange it according to what they need for the game. Whereas when you play the same exact style gameplay for Sony's Spider-Man game, it's New York.
It's New York. Yeah,
like, you can't screw with the geography. Like it's New York to scale, and it's awesome. It's like I have not spent a lot of time in New York, but I feel like I know my way around, because I've been swinging around, and like I know where Hell's Kitchen is in relation to these other things, because Marvel does more of an urban fantasy type thing like that, where they use
that is
real cities, real worlds.
Yeah, that was always Marvel's ethos, which is the heroes outside your window. So the world outside your window. So they are set in New York, it's a fictionalized New York, but it is meant to be New York City. Things that happen in New York happen in their New York. So I think that I didn't know what that. I've seen that tag before. I didn't know what that meant,
and I never even heard it before. I was ashamed, because I'm a lover of fiction, but
I didn't know what it meant, and I couldn't even. I don't even know if I didn't care enough to look it up. But no, that makes sense, because I agree with you. I like those kinds of stories as well, and nothing wrong with a high fantasy story if it's done well. But I like stuff that's grounded, something like this here, where you understand the rules of our world, because it's our world, but then you have your own little twist on it. What just your storyteller, what's your little twist on it here? And in a case like this, it's our world, but it's the world of stories and the power of stories as well. So, and
I mean, and
whether those are vampire stories or zombie stories or whatnot.
Right. And I don't have to guess how people in this world will react to Richie's book, because it's how people would react in our world if someone came out and was like, I'm really a vampire. Here's all the stuff that happened to this Tom Taylor guy. Because we know how we would react. Whereas like I've tried 3 times to read the Broken Earth trilogy. I don't know if you're N.K. Jemisin's fiction. And it's really complicated world building with no crash course, no tutorial. It's got a map. The world building is there. It's trying to tell a character story, an overarching narrative of this world, and extremely complicated, geography, classes, races, mechanics, with no introductory, no spring. So like when someone says something, I'm like, is that unusual? I don't know how that's supposed to hit people. Like I just have to blindly follow their lead. Whereas here, I'm like, okay, like, yes, you're doing something crazy, but I feel grounded enough because of the context that I can hang with you.
I think what it comes down to is because you know the stories of our world, which means you know the stories that the characters in the book know. So when you say, when Richie has a comes out with this memoir or whatever you want to call it, this tell-all book saying he's a vampire, you know how people in that world would react to that because you know the stories about vampires that they know. You know?
Yes.
It's the same knowledge. So you know the fictional stories because Dracula exists. Because we talked about when Lizzie first brought up the idea of we need to figure out what kind of vampire you are. All the various types of vampires in fiction exist. And because you know what those are, because this is our world, you know how they're going to react to Richie saying that. When you're dropped into a completely new world, you don't know. You're right. You don't know what their stories are. So you don't know what common knowledge is. You don't know what their pop culture is. You don't know what their songs are like or anything like that. So the fact that you can connect to when it's grounded in our real world, it's not just because of, it's more than just, I know this because that's actually New York City. And that's what that building is. That's what that building is. And that street's there and that stadium's there. It's more than just that. Is you know how those people are going to react. You know how the world's going to react to things, to anything that's different or weird, because you know what already exists in the world. You know, and so,
right.
And those are the stories that we know. That is that fictional unconsciousness that we all share in our own way in our world, in terms of what pieces of stories, what pieces of pop culture, things that everyone shares together. It may not be the same kind of power that you can wield in the world of the unwritten, but there is still a power there because there's an understanding of, we all know what these things are. We all know what zombies are or what vampires are. And so when zombies are different, like in World War Z, and all of a sudden they're fast, you know,
right?
People are like, wait, zombies aren't fast because, well, who says they can't be? Well, maybe in this world they can be, but that was the initial response. Like, what, zombies are slow. Everyone knows this. Zombies are slow. They're mindless. They want to eat brains.
Right. So, they're moving with rigor mortis.
Yeah. So when you have something that subverts that, it puts people on edge. Like, no, that isn't how that fictional character is supposed to be. You know, because we know those aren't real. Those aren't real zombies. You know, which doesn't make any sense, but it makes perfect sense at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, somehow, you know, Richie convinces this kid to transfer his power to this Roush doll. Yeah, Roush gets his power, and that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like, we may see that kid again. I mean, I will never say never with Mike Carey.
No.
There's no point to me in seeing that kid again.
No.
Because he's played his part.
Yeah.
But clearly Roush and Richie are going to be huge players in Apocalypse.
Yeah. Well, and I love this bit about Roush. I think this encompasses everything about her. She, at one time, simultaneously, does something of good. She saves this kid. This kid is tormented, and things are going very, very badly. You know, so yes, she does save this child from this current situation he's in, and at the same time, gets this immense power for herself, which begins to heal her because she was dying. As she, in her talk with Richie, you know, she's basically the reason she is immortal is because she's turned into wood. You know, she's now like one of the blocks that she makes, but she was turning back into flesh and blood, and thus was dying because she's how old she is. So she gets this power, which now she's going to wield for probably not great purposes, you know, but again, she does it. She does save this kid and save this town from this horrible fate. But now she has this, she now has almost more power than she had before because she's now back in the game, as opposed to, you know, she was dying because Leviathan was dying. Well, now she's back on her own. She has her own chip in the game now. She has her own stake. And yeah, you can assume it's not going to be on the full side of the up and up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see her as outright evil, to be clear.
No. But I'm like, she has an agenda, and again, whether she's good or bad, good or evil, it all depends on her relation to whatever Tommy wants.
Right.
That's it. It's versus like the Cabal, which you could say was like objectively evil, you know, trying to control the world, things like that. Madame Roush, to this point, is really more just whether or not she's helping or hurting whatever Tom wants to do and Tom's friends, you know, because she has done both. She's both hurt and helped them on their quest because it does or does not align with whatever her aim is. So her her role as an antagonist is simply, or protagonist is simply in reference to whatever Tom's goals are.
Yeah. So, well, I was right to expect more from her after her half issue. We got more from her, but clearly still setting the stage, which I think is just, I mean, that's the brilliance of Mike Carey's writing, is that he's building to the conclusion of one story, but is also setting the stage for the next leg of the story.
Yes.
Instead of just letting things like hit a final stopping point and then you do another 6-issue thing where you have to build up all of the story pieces and then conclude it.
Yeah.
He's building one while he's winding down another one.
Yeah.
And you're constantly weaving. And once you understand that rhythm, it's very easy to read.
Yeah.
I mean, I like, there's nothing in 7 or 8, even though it's getting wild and we're doing more world building, we're understanding more. There's nothing that throws me off anymore.
Because you're used to it, reading this kind of story now. And it's funny.
I would now be disappointed if, like, when he stops spinning new story and is just winding down, I will actually be sad.
You'll feel a little empty.
Yeah, I mean, I'll feel empty because like I've grown accustomed to, he's just got more stories up his sleeve. Like, you know, he's wrapping now this one, but he just he scattered seeds for 3 more stories.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is this will be a quick shout out to my brother who I spoke with yesterday, who had been, you know, he listens to the show, so he'll listen to this. He had an observation specifically about you in this book, how, especially early on, when we were talking about how busy the book was, and you talked about you were a little directionless. You had these side stories. You didn't know you had a hard time deciphering what was important because you weren't given any hints as to how this is going to play out.
I think that's where I use my weird closet metaphor. Like, I'm not given the shelves or hooks to hang these things on.
You assume, because you know that this is going, 12 total volumes, 11 volumes plus the OGN. You assume this is going to go somewhere because it did get to finish. It didn't just abruptly get canceled. But in the moment, you couldn't see where anything was going. You couldn't see, why are they introducing these things now? You couldn't see why. But the further we get along, and the more used to you are to reading these types of stories, the clearer the picture gets to you. And the comment my brother had was that when this book was coming out, the type of reader who would have picked this up probably would have been someone who has read a lot of Vertigo books, specifically Sandman, specifically Fables, books that are a little more on the anthology side, where every month you may pick a book up and it's like, well, we're just telling a different story here because these are all stories about stories and storytelling. Sandman is like that. Fables is like that. Unwritten is like that. The Unwritten, however, is a little more of those 3. It's the one that has the most clear narrative structure, where like there actually is telling a story from A to B.
There's an overarching thing.
And it has smaller aspects of kind of this anthology collection of other stories. And those all eventually filter back in, like all the stuff, all the side quests, the flashbacks, the Polly Bruckner stuff, the Tinker, all that stuff filters back in to the main story. But at the time you're reading it, it feels like world building ancillary stuff. Sandman, Fables have overarching narratives, but they're much looser. And at any given month, any issue could be something totally random, totally different, because you're just in the world. And so I think if you were reading this at the time when The Unwritten was coming out, you were probably already primed to have that type of reading experience from a Vertigo story. And so for myself and my brother, who have, even we didn't read The Unwritten when it first came out, by the time we did read it, we had read stories like Sandman and Fables. So when we have those side stories, as you talk about kind of groping in the dark of this closet here, not knowing where anything is, we're more used to that already, for that kind of story and that kind of storytelling, where there is less focus on a direct narrative. And so I think it's fun to see now, as we've gone further through the story, that now you have a little more experience with that, and you're trusting with that now. Now you get this story with Roush that just stops, and it's not like, well, what the hell happens here? You now understand because you have enough history built up with these guys in the story that you know what, that's going to be somewhere. We're going to come back to that at some point, because they've already come back to it once or twice before. We just get these. I mean, total pages of Ralph's story time is got to be like, what, 35 pages maybe, if that.
It's not a lot. Yeah.
Out of all these issues, but she's been sprinkled in all the way through when she factors into the story here, in fact, a little more here, then we get this backstory. And now she gets this big reveal and then nothing, and you're right to think we're going to come back to that. But yeah, had that happened earlier in the story, because it did, it would have put you a little bit uneasy, right? A little bit off with it.
Yeah, I mean,
you weren't ready for it.
But I think it's even
now you
different,
have more experience with it.
Because I've read Sandman, and some of them are like so plainly like one shot type in nature.
Yeah.
Whereas this all seemed to be like, hold this in your head, you're going to need this. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the thing that was throwing me off, is that these did not feel like isolated anthology style stories. This felt like all of these pieces are staying on the board and they will come to play. And I was right, they do.
Yes, they do.
Like every little piece of this comes back.
Well, they are presented a little though, like that first Polly Bruckner story has no framing device. It just says, here's the story, and you're just dropped right into it. And the only
you're talking about Wilson. Yeah.
The only connection is that Paulie as Mr. Bunn is clearly has knowledge of the other world there, but you're just dropped into that story to the point where you don't know how it's going to connect or if it does come back. So yeah, there is no framing device outside of the dialogue they give Paulie. But yeah,
right. Which was enough for me to be like, because like normally, okay, so if he hadn't mentioned Wilson Taylor at all,
and it was just an angry rabbit who clearly
it was just an angry rabbit. Mm-hmm. You would think, is this like a preview of a different book from Vertigo? That's, I mean, like seriously, like the art was different. Mm-hmm. There were, no overlap in the world or storytelling. It was just a totally other piece. And I think that would have been my instinct, would be like, oh, this is just like an unrelated story. Or it's like one of the little, like they're doing with, intermittently with superhero comics, but with Batman right now, you like get your main story for 28 pages, and then you get your little backup story. Yeah. So I think that's what I would have assumed. No, but that's a good take. And I think I also had that revelation. I was scouring the internet this week for other people that have covered the Unwritten. No one's made it past volume 1 and 2, but I sent you a podcast from 2010 of they were discussing Unwritten's volume 1 and 2.
No, just one.
Or just one. Okay.
Just one, yeah.
Yeah, it was just one, and it was after one had come out, and there was nothing else out. And they were clearly steeped in Vertigo reading because they were tracking with it 100%.
Yeah.
Like they knew what to expect. They were not thrown. So yeah, I think a lot of it is that I haven't read a lot of Vertigo stuff. And I think that to me is the purpose of having an imprint. That's, if this was on DC, you would get a lot of superhero readers reading an anthology style thing, being like, what is this?
Yeah.
Why doesn't each have its own self-contained story that wraps up neatly?
Yeah.
And then concludes in a 6-issue thing.
This book definitely fits the ethos of Vertigo, especially this era of Vertigo, which kind of is in the kind of the second decade of it. According to the end of the second decade, which is like a second wave of kind of Vertigo titles. It definitely, there was a vibe that those books put across, and that I don't know how big the readership was, but I'm going to guess they were very loyal, which is why the book got to run as long as it did. Because I don't know how many random, like if you just read Spider-Man or Batman or something like that, I don't know if this book was for you. Not saying you wouldn't enjoy it, but it wouldn't be one that jumped out at you. But if you were a regular Vertigo reader, if you were someone that read all of Sandman and Lucifer, and even like Preacher or and Fables, and I don't know, Ex Machina, whatever it is, if you were reading those books, this would have been up your alley because it would have fit in right with that vibe. Which is maybe a little bit of there's a little pretentiousness to that comic reader. I don't read superhero stuff. I read the mature stuff on Vertigo. You
definitely get that. Although I think even so, my comic shop in St. Louis, which has been renamed, it is either now called or used to be called Apotheosis on South Grand, is a big indie bookstore. And when I went in, I was coming in with recommendations from friends, which was Scott Snyder's Batman, Warren Ellis's Bond, a couple things like that. And I was talking to the shop owners, and they pulled that stuff for me, and I was like, yeah, so like, what else is good? What should I read? And they were like, oh, I haven't really read any superhero stuff. Like, not like in a judgmental way, just like, yeah, like we have it here for people who want it, and that's great. Just don't care. But she was like, well, the book I just read today was called Romulus. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll try that. And, you and I have bonded over that little 4-issue.
That's 4 issues. Yeah, I was going to say
4-issue tragedy that was cut short. And and that was my first experience, one of my first experiences of indie comics. And I was like so discouraged when there was no issue 5. Like I had it like in my head of like when issue 5 should come out, that I like went on Image's website and emailed them like, what the hell? Where is this book? And they emailed back and they're like, yeah, we don't know. It might not be happening anymore. I was like, how do you not know this? And I was reading another book, I think called The Skeptics, which might've been Black Mask or something. Same deal. It went like 4 or 5 issues. Oh, that was a super fun premise. It was like, it was a Cold War era where both the US and Russia had these teenagers that they had convinced the other country they had trained them in telepathy and they could read minds.
That sounds fun.
Then the kids break away and the American kids find out like, oh crap, the Russian kids can actually do that. Like we've just been bluffing. And then it ends after 4 issues. And it was like, well, how could you like that? You had me. It was Black Mask. It was Black. So I had emailed like Black Mask and Image in 1 year being like, guys, you can't just stop this. And apparently they can.
Yeah. And then there's that's the welcome to comics kid. This is how it works. But
I know. No, this is why I love that Mark Russell letter that he had that we read on the podcast, where he was writing Prez and it got canceled halfway through. And he's like, I didn't know.
I think it could happen to a book. I didn't know that was possible.
So I had the exact same welcome to comics moment that Mark Russell did.
Yeah. But no, there is, I mean, like I said, that this type of book, this type of reading it is a different style. And it's not to say that, again, I read tons of superhero stuff. And I think it's great that that shop was like that because, Batman's always going to sell. Spider-Man's always going to sell. Like, you don't need to hand sell. You shouldn't have to hand sell superhero stuff. Like, folks come in for that. Even a book like Spawn. People who read Spawn are going to read everything that comes out with Spawn on it. So you don't need to read it. You don't need to champion that. You don't need to hand sell stuff like that. But yeah, if you have a shop out there who focuses and cares on some of these smaller indie titles, creator-owned titles that can actually move units, that can make a big difference. And I feel like The Unwritten would have been a book that, the people that found it just would have found it and loved it and said it may not have been the biggest audience in the world, but it was clearly enough to sustain. And
it was clearly every comic writer was reading it.
That too. Again, the idea that when you write a story about the power of stories and storytelling, the people who make their living off telling stories are going to be like, yes, this is how it is. This is what creating is like. This is the power. This is the importance of it. So yeah, it had endorsements. So, I think it's cool that to see your journey come around through as you read more and more of this book to kind of get around to the same kind of level of appreciation now and feel like you're on more solid ground now and more trusting of Carey and Gross as they go their way through, even though we are, nearing the end.
Yeah. Although, I think you knew that. I think you had, you get full marks here for being prescient because you knew that I would get there.
Yeah.
I think you and I have discussed enough stories that you were like, just wait till it clicks for him.
Because you were waiting on I know these stories have to play a part. What do these side stories do? I know they have to come together somehow. They have to mean something. And I knew that we're going to. It was the matter of.
But if they didn't, I can enjoy that kind of story as well, as long as it's not framed as something that's meant to connect.
Yeah, and I think,
I think that's the final shout out to your brother.
Yeah.
Morning Glories.
Yeah.
Just something that was like all the stuff's going to connect, and then it doesn't.
Well,
it's over.
Well,
it would have.
That's a different story. That stuff probably would have connected had they ever decided to finish the story. So everything they did feels extraneous because they never got to end it. But I do think they were trying. Their goal, I think, was to have all that stuff connect and have mean something. But yeah, I think, Perry and Gross here, they don't want to waste any time, and they don't waste any time. Everything they present, every story beat, every story mechanic, whether about it's how their world works, how the magic works, how the power works, how the rules in the story universe work, the stuff that they put out in the first couple trades that we covered, and in the third trade when we start really diving into like Jid Suisse and Moby Dick and all that stuff, all those rules still apply, and they never go back and retcon it. They never go back and change it and be like, well, they never go back and say, hey, that vague idea we posited in volume 2. Well, we didn't think that quite worked, so here's a reframing of that mechanic now in volume 7 or 8. The rules they laid out are solid and they follow them, and they have meaning. And I think when you read this in a trade, and if you were to have kind of all the trades and maybe you binge them over a long weekend or something like that, I think you would really, really get those connections. You would see that some of the things and story beats they put in volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4 and all that really start coming home to roost the further we get into exploring the mechanics of the story, the rules of the story universe, the rules of the power that Tommy can yield, that he can wield in our world. It all connects back, and it shows that they, whatever their plan was, whatever document they had, I'm even assuming they had one, like whatever Bible they had for the book to start out with, they executed that. They followed that plan. If they were making this up as they went along in terms of how things worked in the story, then they may be the greatest storytellers in existence. Because I don't see how you could do that, I don't see how you could lay some of these things, some of these hints, these Easter eggs all throughout. I don't see how you could do all that and not have a very, very, very clear plan of how you're going to use these things later.
I mean, I don't understand. I'm 100% with you.
Yeah.
And there's some fantasy purist part of me that is just biased by Tolkien, that those are the rules. You have to have all of that stuff mapped out in advance.
Yeah.
And I remember an interview with the Russo brothers between Infinity War and Endgame, and they were like, yeah, we didn't know how we were going to we knew what comics did.
Yeah.
And we're going to riff on that, but we're going to do our own thing. And they were like, we just decided who to kill and who to leave on the board. We just left ourselves enough pieces to play with so that when we came back to the writer's room, we could comics our way out of it. But they didn't know this is going to be all the payoff for all the original phase 1 characters. They just stumbled across that. It's just as impressive. Just from a different angle.
Because that kind of thinking is how comics typically work, especially ongoing comics.
Right.
When you're talking about a miniseries that's 4, 6, 8, 12 issues, you can have that stuff planned and you can get it, you can do it. But what the Russo brothers describes there is that's how they write Avengers comics. That's how they write Spider-Man. You write, you do your thing, you're a writer, whether you're on for 12 issues or you're on for 50 issues. And when you're done, you just leave it. And then the next person comes in, looks at what you did, looks at what's left and says, I'll use this, this, and this, and I'll bring in this thing here. That's how ongoing comics work. And, The Unwritten was an ongoing comic. This wasn't just a miniseries. It was a 60 some odd issue miniseries, right? That's what it ends up being. So
it's like an HBO miniseries. Yeah.
Yeah. But having that mindset of listen, we're going to have these rules. We're going to have it all planned out. And maybe they had all the specific beats planned out or not. That's not what I'm saying. It's the mechanics of how the story works. The rules of their universe were locked in, and they seeded so much early on that they knew they had to get back to and were going to get back to. That's unusual for comics of this length, because I said the approach in comics is exactly what the Russo brothers talked about. We know the big beats, we know that, and maybe in
right. I think they basically knew everyone has to come back.
Yeah,
we don't really know. They didn't know the 5-year jump. They didn't know, so
exactly. And that's the thing when you're writing a comic that way, you're like, okay, well, we're starting off here. I got my first story arc, and then after the third arc, we know we're planning a big crossover, right? Okay, so that's going to take some time, and at the end of the crossover, we're going to be in this state. So how do we get for the next 12 issues to that? Get to the crossover, and then what happens after that? I don't know. We'll figure it out when we get there. We just know that we're going to get to this point in 2 years. That's that's how comics are written. Ongoing comics are written like that. And it's not that you're making it all up, but a lot of it, you're figuring out issue to issue. It's just what you have to do, because you don't know how things are going to play out. You aren't always certain. TV writing's the same way.
Oh my gosh,
I remember. There's a story about from Lost, the Mr. Echo character.
Yeah,
from season 2, or I think it was season 3, or whatever it was.
It's 3 and 4, yeah,
whatever it was. They had plans for that character, and they had to change them because the actor was like, he got into his contract. He's like, you know what, I don't want this. I'm done. I want to go do something else. And there's not much you can do about it.
It was a really disappointing write-off where it's but going to stare down the black cloud.
But that's what happens, though. There are factors outside of the storyteller's control, and comics are super volatile like that, where things can change from publishing and all of that. So for Carrie and Gross to kind of have the faith to be given to be trusted to tell their story, and then have faith in the publisher and the readership that they could still tell this story, this long form story, and get to all of these points. They had time to connect to things that they introduced 30, 35, 40 issues earlier, concepts and ideas and things that they hadn't touched on for multiple trades, and to see those bits and pieces come back, to see Judge Suisse come back, not specifically because it's that story, but because what we learned about in those issues about the idea of the canker, the idea of how a story comes to life, how it can take hold, what a poison story can do. And this, again, to see Tommy on stage pull that out and just reference that again, and we, the reader, have an understanding of, oh, right, this is a disease story. This is a bad thing, but he's able to contain it, and this is what he can do with it. That stuff was seeded back in volume 3, and here we are in volume 7 now, and we finally hit that again. And
I think
it
volume
works
2
the same way.
Even was where that was.
Is that volume 2?
I think so. I think it was before the Polly Bruckner stuff. Like, they escaped that, and then you get the Polly story.
Oh,
and it was like, right, man, you were like,
because it was
all
right
wrapped
after.
Up.
It was right after they got out of prison. Oh my God, you're right. That was so even further away.
Even earlier, yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, the same idea. They seed that idea, and you read that, and like, okay, we're finally getting. At the time you're reading it, you're like, okay, we're getting some rules here, right? We're getting some insight as to what these story worlds are, how this stuff plays together. Okay, this is good. We're getting some understanding here, and then those specific rules don't come back until 30, 40 issues later, years down the line, but they're the same rules, and you've internalized them, and you see how it works. And now it's becoming important because now Tommy can tap into this at will and not just do it by accident.
Yeah. By the way, we've gone so long in this episode without yet covering the best character in the entire series, who emerges and is tragically cut down, which is Silverhoof.
Yes.
Yes. I'm just like, I adore this character, but we need to talk about how we find. So, by the way, his first name, Shrdlu, Shrdlu.
No idea.
To me, that's like the Superman villain. That I was botched the pronunciation. Exactly. You just say it really fast.
Yeah.
So Shrdlu Silverhoof, absolute, the absolute best character. So anyway, we need to get into what happens with Sandra and Daniel, and I'm sure we'll keep getting,
which leads into Tommy.
Leads into Tommy. I don't think there's much to say. That's kind of a classic. She's looking at disappearing children or disappearing people. Yeah. She very quickly sees the people are disappearing because of Pullman's hand and the way the cult's using it.
Which we know as Pullman's hand. But this is all this is the narrative part in terms of, but I think there is the,
but we
there's the connection to, the connection to, that's, it's Pullman's hand. And we get the idea, we learn that the reason that Didge can survive it is because she's dyslexic.
which is great. The great twist.
Which was a great twist. And, another thing.
But the fact that they go undercover and they find all of these things that have popped out of stories, including the unicorn.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's how. And then there's just that a big explosion of creatures.
All of these fictional animals, these fictional creatures or whatnot. Yeah.
But I don't know that issue number. That's the one where it's like a white cover with Daniel in a cage and, like a big serpent or dragon wrapping him up.
Yeah.
Maybe one of probably artistically the single best issue of the series. Because, you've got Daniel staring down a unicorn and the unicorn who, has the classic prophesier curse of always prophesying. No one believes them. Which my wife believes is true of Trelawney and Harry Potter, that everything Trelawney says is actually true. I've tried multiple times to debunk that, but if you kind of turn your head and squint, basically everything she says is true.
Yeah, I think that's meant to be a bit of a inner character, I think.
So, but then you go, you see Pullman's hand and you're very in the unwritten story. Mm-hmm. Then you get the cult leader's background story with him and Polly Bruckner. And it's like Sin City for a couple of pages.
The art style is so great there. It's so stark. It goes to kind of that tritone. It is very angular. It's got that old school Frank Miller.
The greatest page in the entire series. Yeah. Which I think I already mentioned on or off air, probably both. Wilson banishing, Tom banishing Polly to the realm of the Willowbank Tales. Mm-hmm. And so then you see Didge come back out, yada yada. You find the cult's planning to bomb this Tom speech.
Mm-hmm. His performance, whatever it is,
and they're not trying to kill Tom. They're trying to make Tom unmask himself as Tommy.
Well, so he again, it's a callback to the beginning. He's trying to replicate what happened at the Globe Theater, right?
Right.
When
which you have to have issue 1 in your mind as you read this, which is why, again, to me, this is why it's a different type of story than like Sandman. Because like Sandman, you wouldn't need to remember or even have read the first issue necessarily.
Sandman, it wouldn't be narratively
to pay
important.
Off 50 issues later.
It wouldn't be narratively important to remember those details. But here it is. There are both thematic importance of the story they're trying to tell and the actual direct line narrative A to B story that they're trying to tell. But the Philby's trying to recreate that explosion. That basically showing that when this blows up, like basically that Tommy's going to live. He's gonna survive like he did at that theater explosion, which we know was faked. We know that was faked,
right?
By with the help of Lizzie and all of that to help feed the narrative that Philby now believes.
Tommy, right?
Yeah, and of course, Tom he defused the bomb. We go from there, and then
which, by the way, is the best move in Volume 7 that he diffuses it without magic.
Yeah.
It's just like, what are you guys, stupid? Like, I can solve this.
Yeah. He figures out the password basically because Philby's an idiot. But it is really great. And so we have that, and then we get the revelation that Didge met Lizzie in her short time,
right?
Being disintegrated by Pullman's hand.
And that's like the final panel of the
that is and
the book.
Yeah, and then that takes us. That is kind of the rare. Well, no, not really rare. That's the very classic kind of. Here's a cliffhanger that ends a storyline, and then there's one more issue,
and then there's one more, right?
Yeah, and then that is the flashback to Richie, and we kind of get him. We meet the ghosts. We see that Miriam is still there, or no, Miriam has joined the ghosts of the villa. All the writers who died, and that
the puppet masters. So here's the thing. Yeah. Okay. So, and this is the Mike Carey thing that I think once you're in it, you just accept it and you love it, but would have really hacked me off 4 trades ago. So we end that story with, the bomb and the unicorn and Tom meeting Didge and Daniel. And it's like, okay, all our characters in a room together again. Then you
with
jump
a clear
back.
plan. They mentioned Lizzie, so clearly we're getting together.
Right.
And
you have a
we
quest.
have a mission. Yeah,
yes.
You have a quest.
And then you jump back, and the next issue jumps back to what should have been the first issue here, because it's the bridge between 6 and 7.
It picks up right after 6.
Then you open 8, which is called Orpheus in the Underworld.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a story called Live Like Lazarus, and it starts with a conversation between Didge. So it's forward from the Puppet Masters, but still backward from where the last story ended. And it's like, why are you doing this to us, man? But then it jumps forward, to the quest that they set out on. So it's like, okay, now we're back on pace.
Which at this point is an issue and a half ago from story wise.
Right. And in the previous trade. But yeah, we just keep getting Silverhoof is just solid gold. I kind of wonder if they had to kill him because you just can't write a character that great for so long.
Yeah,
they run out of pithy prophetic things to say.
You do. I really love the idea of him, like, at some point.
I love his severed head still giving prophecies as it's being dropped into a stew.
Very much there.
Oh my gosh.
Much there. I think that there was a point when him and Tom were down in the story world, and Tom basically like, hey, why don't you say and make a prophecy? And he's like, well, you didn't ask a question. And so Tom asks a question, and then Silverhoof gives an answer, and he's like, well, I didn't know that until I said it, Right. Because he can't control the prophecy. He just says it. It comes. He's a vessel, right?
Right. He's just a vessel for it.
Yeah. So he's as much an observer of this as anybody else. It just happens to come from his mouth. But no, Silverhoof is so great. It's such a weird character. Aside from the fact that it's a unicorn, just a weird vibe of a character to put in there. And I do love the interactions of like him with Didge and all them. When how like. Didge is completely unfazed by this.
Yes,
he's like,
after Didge's journey,
he's
to the underworld, or the land of the dead.
It's a unicorn. He assists me in my case or whatever it is. Just like it's like any other thing. She's totally cool with it.
Like it's not going to be admissible in court, but But she's not someone who's worried about the legal ramifications. She wants true justice. She's one of those type of detectives.
Well, and she also
in trouble.
I think she's seen enough now to know that we have moved beyond the earthly realm of justice.
Yes.
Of the human concept of justice. So she's now in on this journey, and they go out into the brush, and they need to help Tommy get into a story. And they get there by a story about a whale, Didge being of Aboriginal descent, which leads to much mockery and derision on top for being dyslexic in the police department there in Brisbane. But Tom once again finds his way into the story world through a story, this time specifically about a whale, even though it's a whale kind of deep in the mainland Australia. They still have a story about it. He's able to connect, and he falls down into the story world and that first level, which is the level of all the massive stories.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of fun stuff in that realm, but nothing really important. He gets attacked by the big polar bear, which I thought was maybe another golden compass shot out.
The animals are always tough because it's always just like fairy tales have animals, and I said a lot of the other animals, the smaller animals we know are from the Willowbank tales, but again, those are the stand-in for
polar bear wouldn't really fit in the Willowbank tales.
No. So, but
especially when it brutally slices other ones in half.
I know.
This one got so violent, which has not really been a thing in this series.
I think it's meant to show kind of the savageness of where these stories are coming from. I do love how the polar bear, like his font is different. The text bubbles are different, they're big and growly. You can hear, they sound like a bear in your head. But there are fun things. Again, when we talk about, the Bennett sisters, there are a lot of Easter eggs here. But it's a step along the way for Tom to get he's gone from the real world into the story world. Now he needs to get from the story world into the underworld, and he does that by, basically falling off the horse, which was not the unicorn. It was a horse. They just tied feathers to its hooves and it was starting to fly. I guess because it's a story world and you can do that kind of thing. But
he was like, we want to make it a crossover before he realizes he can't actually fly.
Yeah.
Because that will break the spell of it. So it's like the magic actually kind of works the same as the above world.
Yeah.
Well, it's fueled by belief.
Yeah. Well, it's also the Roadrunner Coyote thing. As long as you don't look down, you're good. But he falls into what they call Lake Avernus, the gateway to the dead, and he sinks. Well, I would say he sinks to the bottom, but he washes up on shore, and then we are now in the underworld, and where he encounters Cosi and Leon, the two children from the French prison, and he begins this journey.
Who don't recognize him. He doesn't remember anything about himself.
Well, yes, he talks about I guess through the water there. Swallowing that water has a forgettable property to him, and so that there's a slow road to recovery of your memory. But yeah, they make their way through.
Yeah, they make this epic journey into the castle only to meet the throne,
which is Polly Bruckner.
Yeah,
and then once again, hard cut, 2 issues. We get the zombie story with Richie and Dinge.
I know. It's like you've been waiting since the end of volume 2 to see Polly intersect with like Tom and our main characters.
Yeah, exactly. With the story proper. And they do that. And then, so we have that whole story, which again, once you're in it, it ends with Roush, becoming a new player in the game. And then hard cut back to the underworld and back to our story with Tom and Polly. And eventually, we find Lizzie is there. She's in disguise. We find they're holding Wilson hostage, and all of this other kind of story. And they eventually, they find this portal, I guess, which takes them into. We talked about this other version of hell, and we see Pullman is there now. This is where Pullman is now ruling, and kind of the idea of Pullman standing in for Satan or being Satan now. He was always referred to, people talked about him being the devil, when he was out in the real world. And of course we find out that Pullman is actually Cain. And now
that's interesting. In volume 9 in the intro, it says he thinks he's Cain.
Well,
in their little synopsis, which is like, I mean, on one hand in this story, what's the difference between whether someone believes they are or they are?
And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with Lizzie, when she has a moment alone with Wilson, right before she drops him, frees him. She asks him, what was my real name before you took me? Basically all that. And Wilson, I think it's probably truthfully, he doesn't remember. And it's almost like to say
it doesn't matter. Yeah,
exactly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to her, and it shouldn't matter to Lizzie now. I think what they're trying to get across is that this is who she is now. And one of the through lines in her story leading up to the battle at the end of 6 was that her constantly saying or trying to say and trying to convince Tom that everything she's been doing has been of her own accord. That yes, Wilson programmed her for some things, for some steps. And yes, early on, she was in contact with him, taking orders from him, kind of executing their plan, but trying to say that she is her own person now. She's making these choices. And she's like, basically, she is choosing to live as Lizzie Hexam, as this character, as this person, that she has this will to do this now. So whether or not she actually is or isn't, where that origin is, it doesn't matter. Those lines are blurred. And so when you get to someone like Pullman, he said thinks he's Cain. Well, but if he's
thought he's Cain for 3,000 years,
for longer than that. Yeah. So you assume, what he is, deal with it. Let's go with it. But yeah, so we get to that. And there is this, there is this showdown there, but what ultimately ends to is them basically walking away and figuring out how to actually get out of their situation, how to get out of the underworld. And what they come down to is because Pullman, they have this conversation, Pullman and Tommy, of basically what Pullman's end goal is. He wants to end all of this. Right. It's not about winning or losing. It's about been doing this too long. I want all these stories to end. I want this power to end. And Tommy understands that the world can't lose stories. We can't do this.
Right.
And so he leaves and they end up being able to walk away, and they figure out a way home, and they do that by telling a story. They give Paulie the lines to read because he is the king of this place and kind of what he says goes, and they give him the story of Orpheus, and that's how they rebuild the staircase that we've seen so many places. The staircase that was in Sue's house, that was in Miriam's house, the staircase that in the second Paulie story that the animals are trying to climb up, right, and it's been broken. This idea of the staircase, it shows up in one of the Tinker stories that Miriam writes. She uses the Orpheus story in that. And so when Milton comes back and they revive him from his coma, he uses the special chalk to draw stairs to walk back down. So this idea of the endless staircase of all this stuff has been permeating throughout. And that story is the one that they need to get out of the underworld. But of course, only way to do that is for someone to actually,
there's a mechanic.
Actually, yes, someone has to be, I guess in this case, someone has to be Eurydice. Someone has to be Orpheus to turn around, you know?
And it's strange to me that Paulie does it with such sadness and reluctance. It seems like he's become a more interesting character, even though I kind of assume, again, probably foolishly, I assume we're done with Paulie after this.
Yeah. Well, but I thought what I thought you were going to say was it would have seemed that the person most likely to turn around would have been Wilson.
Sure. Yes.
And I think the previous version,
Lizzie wasn't going to, because she wasn't going to accept Tom taking that role.
Yes, and the kids weren't going to, because I don't think they.
To me, Wilson should have taken it. Well, no, you're done, dude.
Well, and I think this is what shows where these characters are. The previous version of Wilson would have done it, but he doesn't. He refuses to. And a previous version of Paulie would have done it without complaint. But here he's like, none of you guys are going to do it. You're going to make me do it. Okay, fine. You're making me be the bad guy. He doesn't want to do it now, but he still does it because he understands that's what he has to do. A previous version of Paulie would have done it without thinking.
Right. Oh yeah. If he was he would have done it to any one of the critters he was leading up those steps.
Exactly.
No problem.
But yeah. So now
and by the way, I meant Wilson should have been in Tom's shoes. Wilson should have been you're on the bench, dude. You've not been a great guy to anyone here.
Sense. That makes sense. But I think again, we are seeing a new version of him now in this. Now he's been tortured, whatever it is. That even then he said the previous version of him, he would have been the one to turn around because he would have understood again the great sacrifice. This is the thing that no one else can do. I'm strong enough to do it. I'm going to turn around and send my kid back because that's how we save everything. Right. Here, he doesn't do that. He can't do it after what he's been through. But you have Paulie. It's left to Paulie basically to be like, all right, fine. You think I'm the bad guy. It's like, again, it's the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories that are told about us. I'm the bad guy. I'm the thug. I'm the muscle. If it's got to fall on anybody, fine. It's got to fall on me, but I'm not going to like it. It's like he's fed up with that version of him. Even though he recognizes it's still part of him. It's like he's trying to reject that part of it, but he's still going to do it because he understands someone has to do it. And it's almost like, well, listen, my hands are already so dirty. What's one more? You know? But still, he's like, to hell with you guys for making me do it.
To me, it's a lot like Snape having to kill Dumbledore with the Avada Kedavra. It's like
there is,
and they have that whole discussion about it, and he's like, he's like, well, I can't let Malfoy do that because it'll taint his soul. And Snape's like, what about mine?
And Dumbledore's like, you know what? No one cares about your soul. It's
Dumbledore's like, only you can know if putting an old man out of his misery and saving him shame and humiliation and a painful death will harm your soul or not.
Yeah.
And
but you're right. But I think there's a level of self-awareness that Paulie has now through his experiences, where he understands that this is who he's perceived to be, and he's going to do it, but he's still going to reject it, and he's going to reject the people there. Because again, he's like, I don't know this. I don't know any of you. In fact, the ones that I do know of you, of your party, I hate. But I'm going to do the thing that none of you are strong enough to do, because you left it to me, because I'm supposed to be the bad guy. It's like that acceptance, that reluctantness that he still does it. But and so it ends.
Right. He took great pleasure in being the bad guy up until then.
Exactly.
Now he's like, now I'm going to do it because I'm the only one strong enough to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. He even just prior to that, as he's ruling the underworld castle, he took pleasure in doing that, in torturing and inflicting his will and all that, up until the point where they're walking out and he gets to go home. He gets to go back, and his salvation, his freedom is right there. And now there's a reluctance. There's an actual anger that he has to be the bad guy, And I think that's an interesting character development for Paulie there, as we see as the story comes to what amounts to a soft close. Because again, it is no spoiler to say that the next story, the next arc, Volume 9, is being the crossover with Fables, is kind of a one-off. It's a different thing, and then we pick back up in Apocalypse #1, aka Volume 10, which is a continuation of the story, basically from the end of 8. So there is an end, there's a continuation, but there is kind of this soft ending of, like, you could see it being like,
if it got canceled, I wouldn't be devastated.
Yeah, you could see that. Okay, our characters are walking out. These kids who died very tragically, they're alive. Lizzie's back. We know Didge and Richie are back out there. They're going to go back out into the real world. And Tommy's sacrificing himself. Tommy willing to be Eurydice to go back into the underworld. That sacrifice is enough. That's going to heal everything. And yeah, if that were it, you could understand that was going to be, that'd be not a fully satisfying ending, but it wouldn't be an unsatisfying ending. Does that make sense? Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. I could have lived with it.
Yeah.
Especially even if the world went on.
Yeah.
Like 50 years later, and it was like, okay, the premise and the world are continuing, but these characters are done. Yeah. I could have lived with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we get even more than that. Just, in the little bit of Volume 9 that I've started to read.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. So yeah, I think, do you have anything else about kind of where we are?
No, I mean, and we've taken up so much time. I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm like, maybe we just need to do like a finale podcast after we, because we got 9 and 10 next week.
Yeah.
10. We have 9 in the Ship That Sank Twice next week, and then 11 and 12. Like, are we going to have all our summative thoughts on 11 and 12 and the series in that 11 and 12, which could be longer than this one?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. These
our hosting fees are going to be out of control. That's all I have to say.
I say these 2 volumes were interesting because I think while a lot of plot happens in 7 is big on the themes because of Roush is talking
in it. Yeah.
Because of what Roush, because it's narrated by Didge mostly, but Roush giving her talk with Richie and Tom giving his talk, the beginning of his talk, his performance in Brisbane, that you get a lot of heavy overarching themes. A lot of stuff happens there. 8 is really a narrative, much more of a narrative story. 8 is much more about the story. It's the quest. We talked about. It's the group coming together. We're going to find Lizzie, and obviously in the process we find a lot more. In the process of finding Lizzie, we find Kosi, Leon, we find Wilson, we find Paulie, we find all the other characters. But that's very A to B narrative story driven there. That the themes of the story are a little bit of what he's talking about with Pullman in their meeting there. But it's excuse me. There's less, I think, there in terms of kind of the mechanics of the greater story of what they're presenting. So I think I don't have much more to say about it. In terms of, aside from what we've already covered, though, although I do think 8 is one of my favorites because I do love the story of Tom going in and kind of everything with echoing the Orpheus story and all that. I think that's really great. It's one of my favorite ones to reread. I think 7, 8 are
sure.
Because I even though it is kind of weird to introduce new characters, this Daniel character, Didge. I like the stuff with the cult. I love Silverhoof. I love being around the unicorn and all that, and how that plays in. Just from a narrative standpoint, I think these are two really fun ones to reread.
Yeah, I mean, what I've said last time, it continues to be true. Each time I finish a volume, I'm like, oh, that was my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's just because the story keeps building on itself.
It's the building blocks. Yep. It's the building blocks going through that you can see how things start to connect. Yep.
That being said, I remember in 7 knowing like, okay, it's going to feel like a letdown because he built to such a big climax. He's going to take some time to build up a head of steam again, which was true.
Yeah.
But there was plenty. I mean, my favorite page in the series was in 7, right?
The flashback scene, basically.
The memory scene. Was like, it may be dumb because it's not like the most important picture, but it just summarizes the series in one page.
No. It's just, you're right. It's a perfect encapsulation. And aside from the fact that it's a beautiful page. It's just,
right. I mean, that's all the reason I need is that I like looking at it, but it captures so much of the idea of the premise in the artwork. And I think that's something that Peter Gross has understood from the beginning.
Yeah.
And, whether you're consciously tracking it or not, he is feeding you information about the world and the premise and the story.
Yeah.
Art. So anyway, I just had 2 quotes that I found. I can't believe I didn't bring them up when we were talking about it, but when we were talking about the wound itself, George Bernard Shaw said that without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable. And it seems like riffing on the same idea. Yep. Right. Henry David Thoreau said, "The world is but a canvas to our imagination," meaning the world's nothing. The world's a clean slate. It's whatever. It's whatever story we're telling ourselves. And that's Tom's speech exactly. So, just all that to say, the completely original comic and storytelling, but the ideas aren't necessarily new. It's just the first time that they've embodied. I mean, it's so funny that these quotes from Henry David Thoreau and George Bernard Shaw are not. They are about the importance of like art and narrative and story, told as a proposition. Whereas Mike Carey has chosen to tell you how important art and narrative and story is through art and narrative and story.
Yeah,
so it's
literalizing those quotes.
Max the medium.
Yeah, it's literal. But in the world of the unwritten, those 2 quotes, like you could easily say, like those 2 quotes, they wrote them because they understood the power of story within the world of the unwritten.
Right, and in the world of the unwritten, like Mark Twain understands it, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So Mark Twain was in on it.
They would have written these things. They would have had those lines because they would have understood the power because they would have been on the inside. So they would have been saying that things we read them in our world as a figurative of like, oh, that's a great way to think about story in the world. In the world of the unwritten, they would have said those things in a literal manner. They would have understood and meant that's what's actually going on. But that's exactly what they're riffing on. That's exactly what this story is all about. The idea that story has this outsized influence on the world and a significant influence on the world.
Yeah, and I think even if someone isn't a lover of fiction, what Tom says is still true. When you think of yourself, you think of the key narrative points in your life that you find to be defining. And I mean, that's what a lot of psychotherapy is about too.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. It's like about discovering the story that you're telling yourself about yourself and the one that you're trying to project out into the world. And then I could get into the philosophy of Charles Taylor, is a Canadian philosopher who is all about expressive individualism, which was basically, the modern quest philosophically. He's not saying right or wrong. He's just saying what it is people look inward, determine who they are, and then express that out into the world. And like the first first like massive popular story for all ages of that new world was Babe. The pig who decides that he's a sheepdog, and then just starts living into that reality, regardless of the fact that he's still in the body of a pig. He's like, no, I've decided that this is who I am and this is what I am, and it is my duty to go live that out. And that's the narrative of the modern age, and that's
I think
very much aligned to the power of story.
It is. I wonder now. You think about that Tom quote. When it was written, this at this point in time, we're in the 2013s here. We're late 2012, early 2013 when the issues are coming out. And again, think about in those 10 years since the proliferation of social media and things like apps specifically like Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff. The idea of projecting yourself, the idea that this is that Twitter is not real life. Instagram is not real life, but yet that's what you're projecting out there. The idea that you can fool yourself and fool your friends and followers because all your Instagram posts are all how great everything is, how lovely everything is, and that is a story you're projecting out there when, so often that's just a mask for what your real life might actually be. And so it's like that idea.
Well, and then there's like this sense in which if I can get enough people to believe it about me, then I'll be able to believe it about myself.
Yes, and the idea of having followers and likes and engagement and all that stuff, that's validation. And so it's like that's how the idea of the unwritten manifests in our real world. In the unwritten, that idea manifests in actually bringing it to life and giving it actual power. For in our world, we see that as like social media influence and clout, as like that endorphin hit, that dopamine rush of getting a like and all that stuff. But
and to get super meta, shout out to Mike Carey for the retweet on episodes 1 and 2, which dropped this week, which made me text you in the middle of the workday. I was like, dude, Mike Carey retweeted us.
But it's the same sort of thing, and it's like it's almost more prevalent now. That Tom's quote about the story, of ourselves is how we view ourselves, and how the world views us and what we project out there. It's like it's more prevalent now because of how ingrained social media is in our everyday life. More so than it was 10 years ago when this book was coming out. It was in its infancy. And to see where it's become now, it's so much more about. I think it's so much more relevant. The idea of projecting a story about yourself and saying, "This is who I am," this is who I want to be. So I'm going to try to make this happen. And if enough people see it, then I can turn this into what I actually want it to be, because I want my life to be like this. This is the person I want to act or be or look like or something like that. It still holds that power, even if it's not the exact same power that Tom can wield in the story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've certainly said more than enough for this week.
We did.
We've cut into people's reading time for volume 9 and 10 next week.
Yeah.
But I absolutely adored these two books. And I think this is saying quite a bit, because this may be one of the best things we'll ever cover here. So I don't want to shortchange it just to feel like, we want to stick to an hour or 90-minute episode or whatever. It takes the time it takes, and it does. When you go to a good book club meeting, sometimes you go over and you run out of tea and charcuterie.
And I think part of it is what you talked about, is that because these build so well together, that it's you're forced to look at what you've just read and also re-examine what came before it. And so we're constantly going back on those ideas, which does make me afraid for volumes 10 and 11 for Apocalypse. Because you're right, having to look back, because by the time we get there, we'll have to look back on everything that comes before it, versus the first two trades when we're just talking about what those were. And then 3 and 4 aren't in isolation, because the building blocks of the foundation is there. We keep getting more and more and more. So
well, and I think we'll try not to retread the same ground.
We'll try not to, but it's tough.
But that's also my thing is, I've been talking to a couple people about, like, maybe somebody wants to come on as a guest, whether it's one of the creators or another podcast creator, and then we could easily justify doing a finale episode where we don't have to say everything we mean to say in 11 and 12. So anyway, by the time you listen to this one, that will already be done.
Yes.
So just let that sink in, whether you're listening the day this comes out or years later. So as always, thank you for listening. Find us on Twitter, Storied Arcs, Instagram, Storied Arcs, storiedarcs.com, or find us back here next week for volumes 9 and 10, which no, they're not numbered 9 and 10. That's the big thing.
Yeah. It is.
It's volume 9, Fables.
The Unwritten Fables, and then the original graphic novel, Tommy Tale and the Shit That Sank Twice, because they did number Apocalypse, even though that's a whole new series technically with a new number 1. They numbered those trades 10 and 11, which is just clear indication that it's the same continuation story.
Right.
They didn't bother renumbering the trades. So read 9 and the original graphic novel, which you can find in both hardcover and I think paperback as well. So read those two. Not so much that because they're connected, but almost because they are kind of two separate stories. But I think that there's a lot of stuff there that we'll talk about and to get into before we get into the actual finale, which will be Apocalypse, which is volumes 10 and 11, which will be the week after that. So
awesome.
Yep, go find it and go read it.
Yep, go find it. Support your local comic shop and share this podcast with a friend while you're at your comic shop.
And don't worry if you're not familiar with Fables. You can jump in and still read 9. I'll try to have a little primer next week when we talk about it to give a little familiarity to it. But I think you can still read the story and you don't have to read 100 and some odd issues of Fables.
That's not my concern. My concern is, what if I really love Fables? Think of all the time and money that will cost me if this ends up being the gateway drug they intend it to be.
It's only currently at 156 issues, so it's really not that big of a deal. It's fine. You can jump in.
Yeah.
Well, and
you don't bag and board. That's also, one short box.
Yeah. Well, they're also there's the Ferris spinoff. There's the Cinderella spinoff. There's the Jack. So in total, there's like 200 some odd issues to read everything involved with Fables. There's a prose book as well. Peter and Max. So listen, it's real light. If you like Fables, it's really easy to jump in and won't cost you anything to read through. But no, I'm looking forward to it because Fables is one of my favorite stories. But again, don't worry if you don't know Fables. I'll give a little primer to start off next episode just to get people's feet wet, and so they're not completely lost. But I do think Volume 9 gives enough of a primer because it is trying to do two things. It wants to recap The Unwritten for any Fables readers who are reading this because they saw it's from Fables, and they also want to do enough to recap Fables so any Unwritten readers who hadn't read Fables can jump in and have a sense of who these characters are and what they're doing. So I think there's enough there so you're not completely lost. But if you have read both or have been reading both, it's great, and it's fun to see these worlds come together.
Yep, and they're both new to me, so I'll be on the same page as you. So either way, you'll either identify with me or Alex in the next one.
Can't wait to get there.
All right, well, we'll see you next week.
Peace.